You've seen the headlines: trade tensions with China, sanctions on Russia, chip shortages, inflation, supply chain chaos. These stories feel disconnected, like separate problems flashing across your screen before disappearing into the news cycle. But what if they're not separate at all? What if they're all symptoms of the same conflict? A war being fought right now, with weapons you can't see and battlefields that don't appear on any map. This isn't the kind of war your grandparents would recognize. There are no front lines, no declarations, no treaties signed in marble halls. Instead, this war is fought through prices at the pump, through which companies can sell semiconductors to whom, through whether your dollars can clear through certain banks, and through who gets to decide what counts as acceptable collateral in the global financial system. The strange part, most people don't realize they're living through it. They just feel the effects. Higher grocery bills, delayed shipments, interest rate decisions that seem to come from nowhere and assume it's just how the economy works now, but it's not. What you're experiencing is the civilian front line of economic warfare, and it's been escalating for over a decade. Here's what economic war actually looks like in practice. It's the United States government calling a bank in Singapore and telling them they can no longer process payments for a Russian oligarch, or else lose access to dollar clearing systems that their entire business depends on. It's export controls that prevent a Chinese tech company from buying the advanced lithography machines needed to manufacture cutting-edge computer chips. It's asset freezes that can lock hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign reserves, making them as worthless as monopoly money overnight. It's the ability to cut off an entire country's energy exports by making it nearly impossible for them to get insurance for their oil tankers or settle payments with buyers. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're tools that have been deployed repeatedly over the past 15 years, and they've reshaped how nations think about power. The turning point came in two waves. The first was 2008, when the global financial system nearly collapsed. Central banks around the world discovered just how dependent they were on the Federal Reserve's willingness to provide dollar liquidity. The Fed opened emergency swap lines, essentially acting as lender of last resort to the entire planet. That crisis revealed something uncomfortable. The financial plumbing that moves money around the world is UNT-neutral infrastructure. It's American infrastructure, and that means it can be turned off. The second wave hit between 2020 and 2022. The pandemic exposed how fragile global supply chains had become, how a shutdown in one factory in Taiwan or one port in Shanghai could cascade into empty shelves in Ohio. Then came the inflation shock, the kind that makes people feel poorer even when their paycheck numbers go up. For millions of Americans, that wasn't an abstract economic indicator. It was choosing between groceries and gas, or watching their savings lose purchasing power month after month. What most people didn't realize was that these disruptions weren't just bad luck or mismanagement. They were the inevitable result of supply chains becoming geopolitical choke points, of commodities being weaponized, of the global trading system being stress-tested in real time. The fundamental revelation is this: America's most powerful weapons aren't aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines. They're settlement rails, the SWIFT messaging system, the Fedwire network, the New York clearinghouses where dollar transactions ultimately get processed. They're the depth and liquidity of U.S. Treasury markets, which the entire world uses as collateral. They're the dollar itself as the reserve currency. The fact that, even when two foreign countries trade with each other, they often do it in dollars because that's where the deepest markets and most reliable legal frameworks exist. This is leverage that doesn't look like leverage until it gets used. And over the past decade, other countries have been watching very carefully every time it does. The story begins in 1944, in a hotel in New Hampshire, while the Second World War was still raging. Delegates from 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods to design the financial architecture of the post-war world. They needed a system that could facilitate trade, stabilize currencies, and prevent the kind of competitive devaluations and economic chaos that had helped fuel the rise of fascism in the 1930s. The solution they landed on was elegant in its simplicity: anchor everything to the US dollar, and anchor the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would peg to the dollar. The dollar would be convertible to gold. America would effectively become the banker to the world. This wasn't purely altruism. The United States emerged from World War II with its industrial base intact, holding roughly two-thirds of the world's gold reserves, and running the only economy capable of supplying capital and goods at scale. The dollar became the global reserve currency not through coercion, but through necessity. If you wanted to rebuild Europe, finance trade, or stabilize your own currency, you needed dollars. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created as part of this architecture, ostensibly to provide stability and development financing. But they operated within a system where dollar liquidity was the foundation of everything. This arrangement worked reasonably well until it didn't. By the late 1960s, The US was running persistent trade deficits and financing the Vietnam War through monetary expansion. Foreign central banks started showing up with dollars, asking to convert them to gold as promised. The math didn't work anymore. There were far more dollars in circulation than there was gold in Fort Knox to back them. So in 1971, President Nixon did something remarkable. He unilaterally ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. He simply closed the gold window. The Bretton Woods system died, but the dollar's dominance didn't. What happened next is where the system we live in today really took shape. Without a gold anchor, the dollar became purely fiat. Its value derived entirely from trust, economic might, and the depth of U.S. institutions. But instead of collapsing, dollar demand actually increased. Why? Because the alternatives were worse, and because a series of arrangements made the dollar indispensable in new ways. The petrodollar dynamic emerged in the 1970s when oil-producing nations, particularly Saudi Arabia, agreed to price oil in dollars and recycle their surplus revenues through U.S. Treasury markets and Western banks. This wasn't a formal treaty, it was a set of aligned incentives. Oil is the most traded commodity on Earth. If you need oil, you need dollars to buy it. If you're selling oil and accumulating dollars, you need somewhere safe and liquid to park those revenues. U.S. Treasuries became that place. The Treasury market grew into the deepest, most liquid bond market in the world, functioning as the global savings account and the collateral that underpins trillions in financial transactions. Here's where the infrastructure piece becomes critical. The dollar's dominance isn't just about tradition or momentum. It's embedded in the actual plumbing of global finance. When people talk about SWIFT sanctions, they're often conflating two different things. SWIFT is a messaging system. It's how banks communicate with each other about payments. But the real power lies in correspondent banking and settlement systems. If you're a bank in Thailand and you want to send dollars to a bank in Brazil, those dollars ultimately need to clear through correspondent banks in New York. The actual settlement happens through Fedwire and the clearinghouse systems that only U.S. banks can access directly. Cutting someone off from those rails doesn't just inconvenience them, it can effectively exile them from the dollar economy. This architecture creates what economists call exorbitant privilege. The U.S. can borrow at lower rates than its fundamentals might otherwise justify because global demand for dollar-denominated safe assets is structural, not discretionary. American companies and the federal government benefit from cheaper funding costs. The U.S. runs persistent current account deficits, buying more from the world than it sells, but those deficits get financed by foreign purchases of U.S. assets. It's a form of citrage, the benefit of issuing the currency everyone else needs. And when crises hit, this privilege deepens. During the 2008 financial crisis and again in 2020, the Federal Reserve opened swap lines with foreign central banks, providing them with dollar liquidity when global funding markets seized up. They were tools to prevent systemic collapse. But they also reinforced a fundamental truth. When the world needs dollars in a hurry, there's only one institution that can create them, and that's the Fed. Every time this happens, it reminds every finance minister and central banker on Earth just how dependent their system is on American monetary plumbing. So the dollar's role as a global control panel wasn't designed in a single moment. It evolved through institutional choices, market depth, legal frameworks, and the gravitational pull of liquidity. For decades, this system worked to America's advantage, while providing stability that most countries found acceptable, even if not ideal. But something shifted. If the infrastructure is that entrenched, and the alternatives that weak, why are major economies suddenly scrambling to build payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely? What made rooting around the system stop being theoretical? February 2022. The world watches as hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves get frozen across Western financial systems. Not seized, not confiscated in the traditional sense, just made inaccessible. Digital entries in accounts that can no longer be moved, traded, or used as collateral. For most people watching the news, this looked like a reasonable response to aggression. But for finance ministers and central bankers in Beijing, New Delhi, Riyadh, and dozens of other capitals, it was something else entirely. It was proof that the safest assets in the world is a foundation of every country's crisis insurance policy, could become worthless overnight if someone in Washington decided your government had crossed the line. This wasn't the first time financial infrastructure had been weaponized. Sanctions have existed for decades, but there's a difference between blocking specific individuals or companies from doing business and cutting off an entire country as central bank from the assets it holds as reserves. One is a scalpel. The other is a demonstration that the operating system itself has an off switch, and someone else controls it. The psychological impact of that moment cannot be overstated. For years, countries had been lectured about holding adequate reserves, about building buffers to weather financial storms. U.S. Treasuries were considered the ultimate safe haven, the asset you hold precisely because it's supposed to be liquid and accessible when everything else is falling apart. Freezing reserves didn't just impose costs on one country. It sent a signal to every other country holding similar assets. Your insurance policy has terms and conditions, you did UNT right. The response wasn't immediate panic or a mass exodus from dollars. Markets don't work that way. But something more subtle began accelerating. Countries started asking a different question. Not how do we replace the dollar, which remains extraordinarily difficult, but how do we reduce our exposure to systems where access can be revoked? That's a question with more practical answers. Export controls told the same story from a different angle. When the U.S. restricted the sale of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to Chinese companies, it wasn't just a trade policy. It was a demonstration that control over critical technology choke points could be used to shape what other countries can build, produce, and develop. The Netherlands and Japan joined these restrictions, not because their companies wanted to lose a major customer, but because access to U.S. technology and markets created leverage that was hard to ignore. The message was clear. The networks that enable modern industry aren't neutral, they're strategic terrain. This is where the nature of the conflict becomes visible. It's not tanks rolling across borders. It's supply chains being reorganized, friendshoring the idea of moving production to allied countries, even if it costs more. Stops being a theoretical concept and starts showing up in corporate strategy documents and government industrial policy. Strategic stockpiles of critical minerals, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals get rebuilt after decades of assuming efficient global markets would always deliver. Companies that spent 40 years optimizing for cost suddenly optimize for resilience, which means redundancy, which means higher prices baked into everything. The economic battlefield isn't about bombs, it's about who controls the choke points, who makes the chips that go into everything, from cars to fighter jets, who refines the rare earth elements that enable batteries and precision electronics, who operates the payment rails that allow money to move between countries, who sets the standards for new technologies, and critically, who decides when access to any of these things gets restricted. What most people don't see is that once these tools get used, they can't be unused. You can't freeze a country's reserves and then expect other countries to forget it happened. You could demonstrate that access to advanced technology is conditional and expect everyone to keep concentrating their supply chains in ways that maximize that vulnerability. The world watches, the world learns, and the world adapts. This is where the tension sits. The dollar remains dominant. U.S. Treasury markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world. American technology still leads in critical areas. But parallel systems start getting built, not to replace the dollar tomorrow, but to create options. China develops its cross-border interbank payment system. Countries negotiate bilateral trade in their own currencies for specific commodities. Regional payment networks get quietly upgraded. None of this ends dollar dominance, but it does something else. It creates redundancy. It builds alternative corridors that didn't exist before. If you want to understand what happens next, the part where this stops being abstract geopolitics and starts showing up as prices on shelves, interest rates on loans, and jobs moving or disappearing, subscribe. Because the consequences of building a more fragmented global economy don't stay overseas. They come home. So here's the real question. If the system is fracturing, not collapsing, but reorganizing into something less integrated and more regional, what does that actually mean for Americans who still need to fill their gas tanks, pay their mortgages, and plan for retirement in a world? You felt it before you understood it. That moment in 2021 when everything seemed to cost more and arrive later? When used cars were suddenly worth thousands more than they'd been 6 months earlier? When lumber prices spiked so hard that building projects got shelved? When grocery bills crept up week after week? Not catastrophically, but persistently enough that you started noticing. The headlines called it supply chain disruptions or pandemic aftershocks. And those weren't wrong, but they weren't complete either. What you were experiencing was the domestic expression of a global system being rewired under pressure. Here's how abstract geopolitics becomes your rent payment. When countries start prioritizing resilience over efficiency, redundancy gets expensive. A supply chain optimized to deliver parts from the cheapest factory on Earth, just in time, works beautifully until it doesn't. Once companies and governments decide they need backup suppliers, alternative routes, and domestic production capacity for critical goods, those costs don't disappear. They get passed through. Every product touched by reshoring, friendshoring, or strategic stockpiling carries a higher base cost. Not because of greed or inefficiencies, but because insurance isn't free. You're paying for buffers that didn't used to exist. Energy tells the same story through a different channel. When geopolitical tensions disrupt oil and gas flows, or when sanctions redirect energy markets, those shocks move through the entire price structure of an economy. Energy isn't just what you pay at the pump, it's embedded in everything. Manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, plastics, chemicals. When energy input costs spike to cascade, Farmers pay more to run equipment and produce fertilizer. Shipping companies pay more to move goods. Manufacturers pay more to operate facilities. All of that shows up months later in the prices consumers see, long after the headlines about the original disruption have faded. The Federal Reserve's response to inflation adds another layer. When prices rise persistently, central banks raise interest rates to cool demand. That's the pressure valve. But higher rates aren't abstract. They change how much it costs to borrow money, which affects everything from mortgages to car loans to business investment decisions. Housing markets slow down because monthly payments get more expensive. Companies delay expansion because the cost of capital went up. Credit card rates rise. The strategy is to reduce spending enough to bring inflation under control. But the mechanism is making money more expensive to borrow, which directly touches household budgets and business planning. And then there's the fiscal arithmetic that nobody wants to talk about but everybody lives with. When interest rates rise, the government's cost to service its existing debt goes up. The United States carries trillions in outstanding debt. And every percentage point increase in average borrowing costs adds tens of billions to annual debt service payments. That's not a moral statement, it's accounting. Those higher interest payments show up in budget constraints, forcing harder trade-offs between spending priorities. Infrastructure, defense, social programs, all of them compete for a pool of resources where a larger share is now going to bondholders. The geopolitical environment that necessitates more strategic spending collides with fiscal reality that makes every dollar harder to allocate. Industrial policy makes this tangible. The CHIPS Act wasn't passed because politicians suddenly became passionate about semiconductor manufacturing. It happened because the country realized that dependent entirely on a few factories in Taiwan and South Korea for the chips that run everything from phones to weapons systems was a strategic vulnerability. Building domestic chip manufacturing capacity costs hundreds of billions of dollars. Those are resources that could have gone elsewhere, but the calculation changed. Efficiency lost priority to resilience. That shift shows up as government spending, which affects fiscal dynamics, and as corporate investment redirected from pure profit maximization to strategic positioning. If you want more episodes that decode how macro forces translate into the micro details of your financial reality, subscribe, because this pattern repeats across sectors. And understanding the mechanism gives you better tools to navigate what's actually happening versus what you being told is happening. The financial system itself gets more expensive to operate when fragmentation increases. Banks and companies dealing across borders face higher compliance costs, more complex risk management, and slower settlement times when payment corridors multiply and regulatory frameworks diverge. Those costs don't stay contained in bank balance sheets. They show up as higher fees, stricter lending standards, and more expensive international transactions. Capital still flows, but with more friction, more due diligence, and more hedging costs built in. This is the part most people don't connect. The grocery bill that's 10% higher than it used to be. The mortgage rate that's double what it was 3 years ago. The factory that's being built in Arizona instead of outsourced to Asia. The portion of the federal budget going to interest payments instead of programs. These aren't separate problems. They're different expressions of the same underlying shift. A global economic system that ran on the assumption of stable rules and frictionless trade is being reconfigured into something more fragmented, more strategic, and more expensive to operate. So if this is the new baseline, not a temporary disruption but a structural change in how the global economy operates, what does winning even look like? And more importantly, what should someone who understands these forces actually do with that knowledge? The question everyone wants answered is whether this ends in collapse or just expensive adjustment. The honest answer is neither, because those aren't the only options. What you're watching isn't the sudden death of a system. It's the slow, uneven restructuring of one. And history suggests that's how these transitions actually happen. Look at 1971. When Nixon closed the gold window, people predicted dollar chaos. What actually happened was messier and slower. There was inflation, there was volatility, there were years of uncertainty, but the dollar didn't collapse. It adapted. The system found a new equilibrium, one based on different mechanics than the Bretton Woods architecture it replaced. The transition was painful, especially if you were trying to plan a business or manage savings during that decade. But it wasn't apocalyptic. It was structural change playing out in real time. The post-2008 period offers another parallel. The financial crisis didn't end dollar dominance. It changed the plumbing. Central banks built swap lines that hadn't existed before. Regulatory frameworks got rewritten. Risk management became more complex and expensive. The system didn't die. It got more layered, more supervised, and more expensive to operate. Those costs showed up everywhere, from bank fees to lending standards to the speed of financial innovation. That's what adaptation looks like when it's measured in institutional rather than dramatic and sudden. What's happening now shares that character. Countries aren't abandoning the dollar en masse because there's no clear alternative that offers the same depth, liquidity, and legal infrastructure, but they are building redundancy. China's cross-border interbank payment system processes a fraction of what SWIFT handles, but it exists, and it's growing. Bilateral trade agreements that settle in local currencies handle specific commodity flows. Not all trade, but those corridors are real, and they're expanding. Reserve managers are slowly, incrementally, increasing their holdings of gold, euros, and other assets. Not to replace dollars, but to reduce concentration risk. This is fragmentation, not replacement. And fragmentation has a specific cost structure. It means more payment corridors to maintain, more currency hedging, more compliance systems, higher transaction friction, regional trade blocs that create insiders and outsiders, supply chains that prioritize security over cost, financial markets that price in geopolitical risk premiums that didn't used to exist. All of this makes the global economy less efficient, which means more expensive. Which means lower growth than the alternative where everyone trusted the same rails and played by the same rules. The incentives driving this are straightforward once you name them. The United States wants to maintain the leverage that comes from controlling critical infrastructure, reserve currency status, and technology choke points. Countries that feel vulnerable to that leverage want optionality, backup systems, and reduced dependence. Both sides are acting rationally within their own frameworks. The collision of those incentives is what creates the tension, the policy shifts, and the economic friction that shows up in everyday prices and decisions. Understanding this gives you a better lens for reading headlines. When you see a story about semiconductor export restrictions, you're looking at a technology choke point being contested. When you see stories about central banks diversifying reserves, you're watching concentration risk being managed. When you see industrial policy subsidies for domestic manufacturing, you're seeing resilience being prioritized over efficiency. None of these are random. They're all responses to the same underlying dynamic, a system where access feels conditional and participants are buying insurance. The most important thing to understand is that this doesn't resolve quickly. Currency regimes, trade architectures, and payment systems change on decade timescales, not year timescales. They change unevenly, accelerated by crises and then stabilizing for years at a time. The 1970s took a decade to find a new equilibrium. The post-2008 adjustments are still playing out 15 years later. This will be similar. Periods of acute tension followed by periods of relative stability, with the overall trajectory pointing toward a more multipolar, more fragmented, more expansive global economic system. If you want more episodes that cut through headlines and give you the frameworks to understand what's actually changing and why, subscribe because the story doesn't end here. Next, we're re-looking at the one variable almost everyone gets wrong when they think about the future of the dollar. The thing that matters more than reserve percentages or payment systems or any of the metrics people obsess over. What determines whether a system like this holds together isn't the elegance of its design. It's not even the depth of its markets. It's something more fundamental, something that can erode slowly, until one day it isn't there anymore. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's where we're going next. But only if you're ready to look at the part of this system that nobody wants to talk. But because it's the hardest one to measure, and the scariest one to lose.